According to a recent study among doctors, their most common aggravation next to patients who don't pay their bills is patients who refuse to obey the doctor's orders. It is estimated that as many as 90% of all patients leave half-used prescription bottles, cheat on diets, continue to smoke, or never return for checkups. I don't know why I was looking at James Phipps, has knee surgery and he's out shoeing horses like, did the doctor tell you that was okay to do that? I don't think so, James. I don't think so. And often this neglect proves detrimental to the patient's health. Sometimes it is fatal. Well, friends, there was an incident in Israel's past which had a similar effect on the nation. You see, in the Old Testament book of Samuel, God commanded Saul to eradicate the Amalekites, including their livestock and their king, Agag. However, Saul chose to obey God halfway, half-heartedly, defeating the Amalekites, but sparing their leader with some of the people and the choices of the livestock. And therefore, and through his prophet Samuel, God condemned Saul's disregard for his command and rejected Saul as king. Samuel then executed Agag, like should have taken place earlier, though apparently some of the king's subjects and descendants escaped to parts unknown. They got out of there. And so it is in the book of Esther, some 400 years after Saul failed to eradicate a people bent against the people of God, that Esther and Mordecai are confronted with a descendant of Agag. Just do what God says. Just do what God says. A man named Haman, who was equally hostile to God's people. Well, saints, this morning my sermon is entitled Pride and Prejudice, and it's a message that will converge upon this foe and enemy of Israel, the wicked Haman. But first, some important details. Guys, King Ahasuerus gives a banquet, but the queen Vashti refuses to parade her beauty before the people and princes, and so she is banished from the king's presence. The king is then advised to put together a beauty pageant of sorts and choose a new queen from out of all the beautiful virgins in the kingdom. And so he does. And the one he chooses is a Jewish girl named Esther, who at the time was living with her relative Mordecai, good old Uncle Mordecai, and she becomes the new queen. Which brings us to chapter 3 and our first glimpse of the man Haman. So let's turn in our Bibles there to Esther chapter 3 if you already haven't. Esther chapter 3. So the Old Testament book, Esther. Chapter 3, and let's begin in verse 1. So after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In fact, guys, a decree is made and sent out by messengers to all the provinces to destroy all the Jews on a given day. Consequently, Mordecai puts on sackcloth and ashes and sits at the king's gate and relays a message to Queen Esther that she must go to the king and implore him his favor and plead with him for her people. Which brings us to chapter 4. So turn there, chapter 4. We'll begin in verse 10. Then Esther spoke to Haddock and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king's these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to this kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Now, friends, it is in chapter 5 that the plot quickly thickens, especially in regards to this man, Haman, the foe and enemy of Israel. So chapter 5 now, verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw that Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Esther answered, my wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. People, it's here we encounter our very first point. That's right, that's a long introduction. First point is a portrait of pride. A portrait of pride. So why is Haman the way he is? Beside the fact that he is a descendant of Agag. That kind of goes against him. Well, I believe his monstrous pride has a lot to do with it. Monster-like pride. I mean, just listen to him now in verses 10 through 12. Same chapter. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friend and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I'm invited by her together with the king. Friends, Haman mentions 5 significant circumstances that lend themselves to a puffing up of one's pride. So again, first, Haman mentions the splendor of his riches, referring to his possessions. And of course, he has a very high opinion of his own worth, his holdings, his property, and his estate. So again, I can picture today a person like that coming out on his porch and looking around at all his vehicles and feeling this real sense of pride, has all these vehicles, and maybe turns out and looks at the pasture and the livestock, and it's just kind of puffing him up. Look at all that I have. My dad was running for DA at one time in Placer County, and my dad lived on this hill. And at night, he had the most beautiful view. He had this big deck, huge deck, hot tub, and you could see the lights of a city down in the valley, Lincoln, and you could probably see all the way to Roseville. This is in Placer County, and almost probably see the lights of Sacramento. And I actually remember my dad kind of being puffed up as he looked at all that and saying, soon I will be district attorney of this whole county, as he looked out over the lights of the county. And we get like that sometimes, right? When we see what we have and what we might have, we get this little sense of pride. Look at all that I've bought, I own. Secondly, Haman mentions the number of his sons. Oh, I'm gonna use this one. I got a couple of sons here, another son over here, referring to his power. And by the way, having many sons in Persia at that time was a great honor and the greatest proof of manly excellence. Having a fine, I'm not trying to think of the word, load of sons. A quiver full of sons. We had some friends growing up we were young Christians in cool California, and they had 6 sons, right? The Cranings. That was kind of a cool, all these sons. Well, it was just like all sons. But I always wish they would have just kept going and maybe have a daughter. That would have been so cool, but she stopped after 6. They stopped. Thirdly, Haman mentions every instance. We have 6? Oh, okay. I know that. Just don't ask me their names. Look at one of them. The Sunday school knows for always. I look at Delaney and I call her Courtney. Courtney, will you read? It's Delaney, Andrew says to me. It's Delaney. Don't you know your own daughter? They love it. That's not a dad joke. That's just incompetence by dad, right? Thirdly, Haman mentions every instance where the king magnified him, referring to his prestige. The king had made him important and great and lifted him up. Again, we can see the pride that a person might have as he moves up in the ranks, and really it's not about whether I like the job anymore, it's where I sit in the company. You don't want to be at the very top, just moving up the ladder. Some people just live for that. Again, I'm not saying that's bad if you've earned it and you work hard, but if it puffs you up too much, you just want to look down at all the, laborers, and you feel so superior, then it could be a problem. Fourthly, Haman mentions how the king had promoted him above the princes and servants of the king, referring to his position. He had been promoted to a place high up in the government. He had a certain rank. Fifthly, Haman mentions that even Esther, the queen, chose him and only him to come with the king to the banquet which she had prepared. And tomorrow also he is invited by her with the king. Not only today, but tomorrow. I got the invite. I'm the only one that got the invite. Again, we can get pretty puffed up when somebody invites us to something special and we got to tell everybody, I've been invited to go to such and do such and such. We got the invite. Referring to his prominence, boasting that he alone would be dining with the king and queen. So there you have it, a portrait of pride that includes such an exaggerated opinion or emphasis on one's possessions, one's power, one's prestige, one's position, and one's prominence. He's just sitting there almost gushing over, thinking about himself. And so what does the Bible say about each? Well, really, it says a lot about each, but I'll just give you an example, maybe a general example. How about we begin with possessions? Guys, Proverbs 28:20 says, a faithful man will abound with blessings, but whoever hastens to be rich will not go unpunished. So making money the biggest thing in your life. Again, it's not bad to have money, but if you make it everything and you think you're something because you have it, that's a biblical problem. That's a spiritual problem. How about power? This is really my life verse. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. I quote that again. I say that every Sunday. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Father, I'm weak today. I'm tired. I'm sick. I'm whatever on this given Sunday. And even if I wasn't sick or tired, I still would be weak. Your grace is sufficient. Your power is made perfect in my weakness. Prestige, Proverbs 12:9 says, better to be lowly and have a servant than to play the great man and lack bread. We've all seen the person that plays the great man. You know, thinks he's something, comes into the room, you know, got his chest up high. The great man has arrived. In prominence, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7 says, for who sees anything different in you? What do you have that you did not receive? If then you received it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? Well, friends, throughout the Bible, God warns his people of the sin of pride, especially in such places as Proverbs. You see it over and over and over again. And while it's easy for us to denounce such a man as this prideful, wicked, evil Haman, unfortunately, you and I are just as vulnerable to get caught up into the same snare and trap. Like continually boasting about what we have, who we are, and where we've been. And I got pictures to prove it. Oh, and where we are headed. But with no reference, here's the problem, to the one who made us and saved us. It's all about us. Look what I have. Look what I've done. Look where I'm going. Well, let's move now to our second point, a poison of pride. A poison of pride. You know, it's bad enough to have to sit back and watch and hear someone boast. Right? You have to sit there and you have to just listen to it and brag and exalt themselves. Oh boy, here he goes again. Here she goes again. But when their pride becomes vindictive, well, it is more than most of us can take. And I believe one of the poisons of pride is prejudice. Prejudice. Yes, I believe it comes from a pride that becomes rather irrational, rather intolerant, rather revengeful, and even rather hateful. And I think really we see more and more of this every day. Think about it. A pride that becomes irrational, totally intolerant. What happened to that tolerance? Preaching tolerance, teaching tolerance. And now there is no tolerance. Rather revengeful and even rather hateful. Most of the time towards those of another race or belief system or social status. I mean, really, those are the three biggies. And by the way, Mordecai fits nicely and precisely with all of the above. Race, belief system, and social status. And of course, it is the evil Haman who is the villain in the book of Esther, who displays this very poison of pride. For instance, let's look at scene, I'll call it scene number 1, back to chapter 3. Scene 1, chapter 3, verse 2. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman. But the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then verse 5, and when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. He was irrational. He was revengeful. He was hateful. He was mad. Scene 2, go back to chapter 5. Verse 9. And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. So Haman was irritated. He was enraged, furious, and filled with vindictiveness by the very presence of this Jew Mordecai, who refuses to honor me. How dare he refuse to stand up or refuse to show fear in my presence or refuse to bow down to me. In fact, though I have glorious possessions, power, prestige, position, and prominence, chapter 5, verse 13, yet all this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. This stuff is worthless when I see that man disrespect me, dishonor me. Doesn't he know who I am? Won't bow down to me. So verse 14, Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. People, you better believe this advice pleased Haman. It's like the best advice in the world. This will show that Jew who he is messing with. Won't bow down to me. I'll take care of him. Show him. Gallows 50 cubits high. People, we're talking 75 feet. Or almost 8 stories high. It's like the water tower in McKenna. From that little town, you see it, if you look up, the water tower. We got a guy in our church that used to take care of the water there. Tall enough for the whole city to see this planned, public, prejudicial, enraged execution. Everybody will see it. Everybody will witness it. Irrational? Yes. 50 cubits high, 75 feet high, almost 8 stories high. Irrational, yes. Revengeful, yes. Hateful, oh, you better believe it. All of the above, and in its highest, most sinful form. You just see him seething at the bit. Like an angry horse that you bridle up. You don't dare get on that horse. Guys, the man Haman was so overwrought about Mordecai that he could not even enjoy those things that made him so prideful to begin with. That he decided to make up some charge against Mordecai and have him executed. Of course, throughout history, we have witnessed such poison corrupt both men and women. Think of Ivan IV, Hitler, Stalin, Khan, Attila the Hun. Could go on and on. Down through the ages, the evil of prejudice rearing its ugly head, then thankfully cut off. And then another part of the world rears its ugly head, eventually cut off. Another part of the world rears its ugly head, and hopefully cut off. For the next one to rise. Which now brings us to our third point, a peril of pride. A peril of pride. So chapter 6, verse 1. Let's read this. So again, this idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. On that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorial deeds, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" Remember, the plot thickened. This is where the plot turns. The king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man who the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me? Wow, like I got everything." And Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, this is what I would like. This is what you should do for me. Let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." Can you imagine Haman? Fire coming out his ears. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everywhere everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." While they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. Chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." The king Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the king rose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, Will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house?" Again, we can see Haman fumbling on the ground on his knees, begging Esther for his life. It says, as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Habona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the wrath of the king abated. People, Haman's pride, or prior boasting about, only accentuated his humiliation and fall from favor. Again, he went from this prideful, boasting, arrogant person to falling quickly and heavily. And he was hanged on his own gallows for all the city to see. Yes, the Bible does warn us about the peril of pride. Like in the Old Testament, Proverbs 16:15, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And also in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12, therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. Well, so then if you and I were asked the question, and I'll ask you it, did the wicked Haman get what he deserved? Most of us would say hearty, yes, amen. Hang him, hang him. But in so answering, we must remember that it was Jesus who also answered the Pharisees in their pride by saying, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone. Well, friends, pride and its poison, prejudice, are with the realm of possibility, even for those of us who claim to be Christians. Think about that. Pride and prejudice. And truly, pride can rear its ugly head at a moment's notice. As we walk out on our porch, as we look around, as we go into our garage, can rear its ugly head at a moment's notice. And if we say, well, not with me, not with me, I believe we've already proved it to be true. Because that sounds prideful as well, doesn't it? I would never be prideful. Chest high, pointed out. Not me. I'm not of the arrogant sort. I would never act like that. Your children are going, gag me. Of course, it's the world that constantly corrupts us into thinking, the world, that our worth is based on our possessions, on our power, our prestige, our position, and our prominence. They feed this to us day in and day out. Yet, friends, we should all know by now, these worldly pursuits aren't meant to satisfy us. We all should know that by now. No, but only God can do that. Only God can truly satisfy us. You see, only a life fully surrendered to Christ will ultimately satisfy. It's not going to be the new car out in the driveway or the new appliance or this or that. That will not, those things get old and now you need the next new one. Think about it. Our souls were made by God, for God, and nothing but God can fill us and make us happy. Being satisfied in God. Being satisfied and filled with God. Well, so people, truly pride is a sin of worse proportions. Again, that's why you see it like in every proverb, the sin of pride. It is trusting in our own accomplishments, in our own worth, and what our own hands have made. I've made this. I've made myself into who I am today. Moreover, it was Haman's pride that raised the gallows. And it was the Jewish leaders' pride that raised the cross. Think about that. Yet it was John the Baptist who had it right. When in John chapter 3, if you want to turn there, John chapter 3. Beginning in verse 22, said these words. After this, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside. He remained there with them and was baptizing. John also was baptizing at Aenon near Salim because water was plentiful there, and people were coming and being baptized, for John had not been put in prison. Now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew over purification. And they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing, and all are going to him. John answered, a person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, but I must decrease. Brothers and sisters, family and friends, I preach this message this morning not to discourage you, but to encourage you to follow God, to follow Jesus even more and more and more and more as you see the day approaching. Therefore, let me ask you, are you willing to admit any pride on your part and confess it? Or are you going to sit there stubbornly and say, I'm not prideful? I mean, I look around and I see pride, but I'm not prideful. Are you willing to admit any pride on your part and confess it? Rick raised his hand. I'm not asking you to raise your hand, but really, if you're sitting there and going, I'm not going to do it. Are you willing to say, like John, he must increase, I must decrease? Are you willing to do your best, your part, to exalt him and to live for his glory, not your own? For his glory and not your own. To build his kingdom and not your own. People, one of the major themes of the book of Esther is God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness. So please, whatever you do, don't allow your own pride to get in the way of truly trusting in him. For everything. For everything. For everything.